of that whole period of history. Well, in 1889, 89, from Key West, the new U.S. battleship, the USS Maine, sailed in to fly the flag and impose some sort of presence of the American forces into Havana. And it was considered a courtesy call for the Navy, but after a week or two, the ship blew up. It was a brand new ship also, so this was the pride of the Navy, and they could not understand why it would suddenly explode. They blamed Spanish saboteurs or other elements of the Cuban revolutionary forces, but over time the analysis has said that it was actually coal dust in the boiler that then caught flame and the whole ship blew up. But in the period, the anger over Cuba and the Spanish led to the Spanish-American War. The wreck itself was pulled up and then taken out further out and sunk in a ceremony outside of the harbor because it was a hazard in the harbor. But you remember the old cry, remember the Maine. Well, it's remembered in many memorials. This is Arlington National Cemetery. This is the Maine Monument in Central Park of New York City with Columbia leading the light in the future. I mean, this is a very triumphant time for, let's say, the American expansionism. So the Cubans have a different opinion about it because the Colossus to the north, the great American industrial country, they always feared would just come and gobble up Cuba like other islands it would do. And in this case, it was to save the Cuban people from the Spanish regime at the time, which was made short work of with Teddy Roosevelt, San Juan Hill, and then the various forces came in. And at that time, Teddy Roosevelt famously was, speak softly and carry a big stick. And so the Caribbean Sea became sort of this playground for American business and military and interests. And so Cuba itself was a great prize. But the Platt Amendment passed in Congress in 1906 specifically forbade the annexation of Cuba to become what it would have been the 49th state. And there was advocates in the U.S. to say, well, why don't we just take a few islands in the Caribbean and make a bigger place? Well, the main argument was that they are all Spanish speakers and we can't understand them. And we don't want to have to manage their unruly population. But the U.S. policy had many interventions and many deals all through the area. And this is an example of where history is somewhat uncomfortable. And I took this picture just today because there's a painting on the 5th deck as you go out of the main atrium of, I'm not sure who even the artist is, but it shows sort of this great juggernaut, which obviously is American interest. You can see the Capitol up on the aft, and then you can see Cuba and Haiti and all these other islands sort of being pushed around. Now, I don't understand why this painting is here, but it's very allegorical, and you can just sort of study it for your own interest. But back in those days, the conflict of nations and empires and democracy versus royalty versus that, and the other were in a very uncomfortable period of history because it came to war after war, revolution, all that. So Cuba has been very afflicted. Now this is the tomb of the great revolutionary Jose Marti, who died in 1905 fighting the Spanish. But at his monument in Santiago de Cuba, they have inscribed there one of his poems, which briefly goes, stand up for your honor. Remove those leg irons from the insensitive ones who drinks himself senseless in the arms of vengeance and forgets both God and his family. And erase all of this and you will enable the man who has not yet learned to hate the lash and the voice of insult or the sound of chains to forget his bitterest days. So Marti was a poet, and he was sort of his inflammatory writing encouraged many Cubans to resist the Spanish. But the problem with Cuba is that it even got independence under the view of the Americans. It fell into dictatorship, and the last one was Batista, who was very cruel and would arrest people, kill people, and it drove out others that went to Key West and other places and resisted him. and a lot of them were in Florida, actually. But he was sort of a towering figure who worked very closely with the criminal gangs that had left the American cities to set up casinos and bars and hotels in Havana especially. And so this was suddenly a very wealthy and a very corrupt government in town. While many people were starving in the countryside, boatloads of people would come and just have the pleasures of Havana, which were notorious. I'll leave it at that. Meanwhile, some of the intellectuals, like the young teacher Fidel Castro, spoke against it and tried to rebel against it, went into the mountains, was chased. He might have been killed, but he got away, and then he came back in, and there were riots and strikes and things like this in the cities. And then finally, the U.S. government withdrew its support of Batista and said, you have to compromise with him. Well, you know, they were so bitterly enemies that there was no compromise. There was a lot of murders and killings and slaughter all through Cuba. And Fidel, who was a very extreme thinker and ruthless in his own way, gloated that suddenly he was in charge when he might have been hiding in the woods for a long time. But there he was with Che Guevara, the former doctor, and they became the revolutionary leaders of the whole Latin America uprising. And they changed the country quite a bit. They drove out 1 million or more middle class and business people. One of the biggest problems with Cuba is that it would never compromise. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of cases of claims in U.S. courts about confiscation of property and things like that, that Fidel and the government would never give even a penny on the dollar, and he would never compromise. And that's why we're still in the situation of an embargo, where the Cuban people have survived through, you know, other attempts like the Bay of Pigs and the presence of Guantanamo and all this. And we're visiting it at a time when those historical problems are still evident, and these problems have not been resolved. Though I understand there's a plan to make Guantanamo, which is a beautiful bay, into a new resort golf course sort of thing once somebody gets the deal. But meanwhile, in Havana, you have all this, I would call grotesque Soviet-style architecture and nationalism. And here's a poster in downtown which says, Señores Imperialistas. Imperialists, we absolutely are not afraid of anything. And so there's sort of this belligerence, so it looks like a national culture that they want to oppose the Yankees. But meanwhile, when we go there as individuals, people say they're very friendly and they're very happy to see me because the poverty of Cuba is so extensive, more than any place in the Caribbean even. A lot of islands are desperate, but they have more population and more people that have less than probably most places. But Fidel has provided education, medical care, and some things to the people, but it's still a very difficult society. In 1991, they legalized the dollar, which changed the economy considerably since they had no more support or trade with the old Soviet Union. So Obama met Raul Castro, the younger brother of Fidel, who is now passed on. And Raul famously said, we do not want our grandchildren continuing these difficulties. We should be friends and have trade and prosperity, and you know, why are we this way? And the example in some political circles is, if we do not cooperate with the communist government of Castro and of Cuba, then why are we doing it with the Chinese, who are a much bigger problem, but then business sort of determines certain things. And in recent years, there have been protests from the Cuban people. These are the Madres en Blanco, they're the mothers who dress white to protest that their children have been put in jail for their political opinions. So they protest every Sunday outside of government offices. And the Cuban government has grudgingly allowed some local elections. In Spanish, it says, sin amos, sin imposiciones. It means we have no resentments and no impositions on what you want to decide, except that they don't allow election of their national leadership, only local area. But anyway, this is Havana today, and we will be docking on the inside of the harbor, but it's a fairly big city. It's about 4 million people spread out on the coast, and we come in the main entrance where the big Castle de Moro is up there. Then we will dock on the bottom of this map in the docks in Old Havana. And then you can walk all through the town. The Old Havana is actually very comfortable to go just wandering around in. There are vast suburban areas also, but many of the things you want to see, the museums and the cathedral and the castles and all this, are on the tour, or else if you can just go on your own. And then the city spreads out quite a bit. Vedado and other fashionable neighborhoods are being fixed up. This is one of the old places, the Arco de Belén. So it's very tired looking, but it has not been destroyed or redeveloped that much. And now it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, so there's funding to fix some of the major monuments like the cathedral. This is the old Hotel Nacional, which was famous for its gambling dens, and mafiosi would live there. And then on the streets you see all these cars, which I mentioned before are the remnant and the result of the embargo, that they keep them going even if it's a lot of trouble. This car has a name of Barco de Oro, which means the golden boat. And so you'll see a lot of street life. The barbers are curiously politically important, because that's where the revolutionaries would trade information. They go get a haircut and talk to the barber and the people next to them. So that was a function back in the revolutionary days. And then I'll show you just a few more sites of the monuments. The cemetery of Columbus is not buried here. They named it after him. But there are these beautiful churches out in the countryside. This is near Santiago de Cuba, the Iglesia de Cobre, which is the copper church, because they did, under the colonial time, did a lot of copper mining. And so in that church is an altar with a beautiful virgin that has a cloak made of pure copper. Then there, south of Havana on the southern shores, this island of youth, Isla de Juventud, which was a place where they would send the youth to go in military training and in educational purposes. But it's sort of this wild island, which also has a lot of marble that is mined and then built in monuments in Havana. But everywhere you go, you get there's a strong countryside culture. They call jiveritos, people who are farmers, but they also work in the cigar factories. They have this in Havana too, but it's all over the country where they grow it and they roll it. Curiously, the soil means that the cigars don't have that much nicotine, so it's better if you smoke. In this particular factory, supposedly they can smoke all they want, but they have to produce more than they smoke. But they make a lot of cigars here. And I was asked whether we can buy and bring it home. I think if you only have a few, it's okay, but a truckload of it, I think, is still under embargo. And if we had the chance, I know there's a tour to Vinales, the countryside valley outside of Havana, and then you see how, let's say, rudimentary the life is out in the far countryside. And this is something of the culture, because like other countries, the rural area has its own music, has its own way of speaking, and sugarcane was the major crop that they would export, they used to call it the white gold of the Caribbean. They still cut it, and it's not essential for sweetening anymore. They mostly make rum with it. And so these other remote towns are sort of lost in a bit of time, because there has not been much economy to rebuild or develop things, even though the government tries to do things, but there's not much to do in Cuba other than now tourism. But I had a friend in the U.S. who was Cuban, and he was taken with his family out when he was about 8 years old, and he went back to one of these little towns, and he went back to the house where he was born and he grew up, and he just knocked on the door because there was no telephone to tell people, and he was let in by an older woman, said, "Oh, Roberto, you're back to your home. Well, come on in." And he went back in the living room, and the pictures of his family were still on the wall. There were 4 other families living in the bedrooms, but this woman said, "This is your home, even though the government said we could live in it. Whenever you want to come back, we consider it yours." And so this is what may, heal the wounds of this society and create a kind of a more normal situation. But out in the countryside, it's still fairly rudimentary, slowly changing. You have a new generation that is now more aware of the world. They used to say the Cubans would say, well, we have many benefits from the revolution, but it's like living in a big tropical prison. We can't go anywhere. And of course, the new generation wants to know everything and go everywhere. And so there's a great let's say, yearning on the part of youth to, let's say, let all this bad history go, and why can't we go travel, and why is this still happening? And I'm just going to leave you with the fact, with the expression that probably the most important product that Cuba has given the world is its music. The combination of the Spanish, the Native American, and the African musical traditions have led to this very vibrant music. And so everybody may not have enough materials, but they often have a band and they are out at night and they're enjoying themselves. I was playing a bit of music from one of the countryside bands when you came in. You can listen to it more, but the exuberance of the people is palpable, especially if you go out at night. I think there's some tours out into Havana at night where there are, of course, big stage shows, but even out in the countryside, people are very animated to sing and dance and enjoy their own company. This is what I was playing, the Muñequitos de Matanzas, which is out in the Oriente. And of course, some of the Cuban performers were very famous. Carmen Miranda, who became a film star, and all of the Perez Prato, and all those 1920s and 30s bands were world famous, and they led us to all know about the cha-cha-cha and the rumba and all of that. And then salsa queen of Celia Cruz, who was an exile Cuban, but she was the queen of salsa singing until her recent death. And this is sort of the, out of the earth and the people of Cuba have come this vibrant musical culture, which, at least in Florida, is most typified by Gloria Estefan and her Miami Mambo machine. And so that musical culture is perhaps the greatest gift that Cuba has given to the world. And now, when it's getting a little more prosperous, it has more lights, more clubs, and more visitors than ever, the biggest question for the Cubans is how much of the tourism do we want to do that will maybe take us a bit out of poverty, but it kind of imposes a whole new world upon them. And many other little islands in the Caribbean have had these kind of developments and overwhelmed by the cruise ships and things like this. So the Cuban government and even the U.S. government are sort of only slowly allowing the kind of development that could happen maybe too fast. But now you can go down there and rent a villa and stay at a resort. And the problem with the other Caribbean islands are very afraid that if Cuba is completely open in a, let's say, an open market society, which may happen eventually, it'll take all of the tourism away from Jamaica and Puerto Rico and all these other islands that would be much more expensive just because of the wage rates and such. So as we go on out of Key West, I just wanted to read a saying of a traveler there once upon a time, 1898, who said, "When first in the dim light of early morning I saw the shores of Cuba rise and define themselves from dark blue horizons, I felt as if I had sailed with Captain Silver and first gazed on Treasure Island. And here is a place where real things are going on. Here is a place where anything might happen." Well, the writer was a young Winston Churchill, and he, of course, went on to do other things. But these are the hills that he was talking about. As you approach it, it's a very lush island and kind of mysterious, and we're only in the big city, but I hope we can all have the opportunity to go back and explore more. So I'm going to leave you with one last picture of that I took a year or two ago just on the way past Cuba, and the question is that a sunrise or a sunset? It's both, depending on where you are. Well, anyway, with that, I wish you have a great trip on the ship and to Cuba, and I look forward to meeting you and having a great trip with you. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, our thanks to Captain Richard Heyman. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you.
And for you,